Good morning. I'm Raleigh Flynn, for those of you who don't know me, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank and a registered 501c3. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to our co-hosts, Dr. John Nagl and the Haverford School, as well as to Eileen Rosenau, James Gately, and John Piasecki, who are also co-hosts of our Mind series. We're grateful to them for their support, without which we could not do this. For those of you who don't know FPRI, we're based in Philadelphia. We're a think tank, we're nonpartisan, and we're committed to bringing the highest scholarship and expert analysis on international affairs and national security. Also like to thank our members and partners for their generous support, without which we could not be here today. This morning, we have a presentation on what is Putin think, and I'm sure you are all thinking about this right now, which is why you're here. Our director of Eurasia program at FPRI, Chris Miller, will be here this morning speaking about this topic, something he is extremely well versed in and certainly qualified to talk about. I'll be turning it over to Dr. John Nagl, our co-host of this program, who is the 9th headmaster of the Haverford School and also a senior fellow at FPRI. Prior to coming to the Haverford School in 2013, he was a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy and also taught at West Point in Georgetown. He was previously the president of the Center for a New American Security in D.C., where he remains a non-resident fellow. He has had a stellar career even before arriving at the Haverford School, 20 years in the Army, leading a tank platoon in Operation Desert Storm, and serving as the operations officer of a tank battalion task force in Operation Iraqi Freedom. He's also a distinguished graduate of the United States Military Academy and a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, where he earned his master's and doctoral degrees. He's the author of Knife Fights, a memoir of modern war and learning to eat soup with a knife. He was also, which is how I met him originally, many years ago, he was on the writing team that produced the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. He's a frequent contributor to the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and has appeared on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, that was a little while ago, and The Daily Show. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to John Nagl, but I just realized I have to do a little bit of housekeeping before I start. First of all, apparently, we're hearing that Zoom has had some issues this morning, some glitches, and so if you're having trouble, be aware of that and contact us, we can help you. And also to ask a question, and we encourage you as always to do that, go down to the bottom of your screen, we will see a chat button, which will bring up on the right side of your screen a window where you can type your questions. We encourage your feedback, your questions. You can send those to everyone, or you can send them individually to an individual if you wish. So without further ado, I'm really thrilled to turn this over to John Nagl for what I know will be a really interesting discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Raleigh, for those very kind words, and thanks to everybody for joining this FPRI series. We love hosting this at the Haverford School. We do wine, we do cheese, we gather together in our ball auditorium. We don't get to do any of that stuff now, and it's enormously disappointing, but it is great that technology does allow us to get together virtually and to have great engaged and engaging intellectual discussions with people like Dr. Chris Miller. Chris is the director of the Foreign Policy Research Eurasia program. He's also assistant professor of international history at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. His research examines Russian politics, foreign policy, and economics. His most recent book is Putinomics, and money in Resurgent Russia, which has been reviewed in publications such as the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, the National Interest, and the Times Literary Supplement. He's the author of The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union, which was published in 2016. Chris is a regular contributor to Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, the Wall Street Journal, American Interest. He received his doctorate from Yale and his bachelor's degree from Harvard University. And I personally am always pleased when people overcome those sort of early disadvantages in order to achieve greatness intellectually and academically. And the way we're going to do this is I've got a couple of questions to ask Chris. I got a smile. And then we will turn it over to you for what I am sure will be much better questions. But we'll start with me. And the occasion today, it's being celebrated neither in Russia nor here, as perhaps it might have been in a different set of circumstances, but I believe I'm correct that this month, May 2020, marks the 20th, is literally the 20th anniversary of Vladimir Putin's ascension to power. Am I correct on that, Chris?
That's right. This is 20 years of Putin as president of Russia, which makes him now the longest serving Russian leader since Stalin and the second longest serving Russian leader since the time of the Tsars. But it's an anniversary that no one in the United States certainly is celebrating. And in Russia, too, it's not an anniversary that is widely marked because the Kremlin is keen not to seem as though it's been in power for too long. Although Putin has no plans to leave, he's actually in the process of amending the Russian constitution to reset term limits and allow himself to stay president until 2036. The reality is that the Russian leadership is afraid that Putin is beginning to seem stale. He has no new ideas. He's had more or less the same team of his advisors with him for the past 20 years. And the Russian populace is beginning to wonder whether some new faces might be welcome. The problem being that there aren't any new faces they're allowed to hear from. So the question of, is Putin turning into Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader who presided over stagnation, is a question that many people in Russia are thinking about today, and there's no politically acceptable answer. So it's far better, far safer from the Kremlin's perspective not to talk at all about the anniversary, and instead hope that no one remembers that Putin has been in power for as long as many Russians have been alive.
Goodness. And is his handling of the COVID-19 crisis helping him or hurting him? Is it accelerating or move away from the comparison with Brezhnev's stagnation?
I think the honest answer to that question, John, is that it's too soon to tell. I think if we had tried to predict the outcome of the COVID crisis when news of the virus first emerged in January, few of us would have predicted where we would be just 3 or 4 months later. And so it's with some trepidation that I try to answer anything predictive about the effect of COVID on politics in Russia or in any country. But I think it is fair to say that the Russian leadership is quite worried about COVID for several reasons. First off, President Putin has had a number of his key associates diagnosed and hospitalized with COVID. The Russian Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin, has been diagnosed with COVID. Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, was yesterday diagnosed and hospitalized with COVID. And so for a leadership that's aging and for a president who is in his late 60s, on a personal level, I think it's a matter of some concern that so many of his close associates have in fact been infected. We don't have any information from the Kremlin about whether Putin has been personally tested for COVID. I think we have to presume that he has been, but I think there is a sense in which COVID is shocking the Kremlin, not only in terms of its broader effects on the Russian polity, but also on the Russian leadership on a personal level. But if you zoom out from that and look at Russia as a whole, Russia's been hit really quite hard by COVID. unlike many other countries in Europe and like the US, if you look solely at the infection count and the death rate from COVID, Russia looks like it's been relatively lightly hit in comparison to other countries. But when you start to dig down into the data, what you find in Russia is substantial evidence of undercounting of COVID deaths. And I don't actually think that this is predominantly the result of a government-directed cover-up. I think it's a result of poorly collected data. But what you find is that there's a huge spike in Moscow in the number of deaths in April compared to what's normal, and only a much smaller spike in the number of people reported to have died from COVID. But I think we can safely assume that many, if not most, of the excess deaths in Moscow in April were in fact due to COVID. And although we don't have data for other cities across the country yet, I would expect to see similar patterns in many other cities. So there has been a really significant health shock from COVID, which the Russian government hasn't managed very well. One of the reasons it hasn't managed it well is because Russia's health system has been underinvested in for some time. Putin and the government overall has made a decision over the past several years not to invest in health. Health spending has lagged what many of Russia's neighbors and peers invest. And so Russia entered the COVID crisis with a mediocre health system. And as a result of that, Russia doesn't have many of the technologies and the capabilities that you would want to fight COVID properly, especially when you look outside of the big cities in the regions where hospitals are heavily underfunded, they lack the technology, they lack the trained personnel. On top of that, you can add another factor, which is that Russia has done a lot of testing for COVID, but the tests that Russia uses to assess whether somebody has COVID are substantially less accurate than the types of tests used in the United States and Europe. And so Russia actually in January and February had very high testing numbers and very low infection rates, but we now know that's because the tests are far less accurate than comparable tests in other countries. So when you put all of this together, Russia's been undercounting COVID deaths, it's been undercounting COVID infections, and it's got a health system that outside of the big cities is completely unprepared to deal with the type of crisis that COVID has created. So from the individual health perspective of Russian leaders, but also the aggregate health perspective of the Russian population, it really is a very serious issue. I'll add one other point on the health side. Many of you are probably aware that Russia's society is aging quite rapidly as almost any country in Europe. And COVID is, of course, a virus that is particularly dangerous for those on the elder side of the age distribution. And so the older the age distribution of a country, the more likely it is to have more severe illnesses and more deaths from COVID. So when you put all of these factors together, COVID is a very serious issue for Russia, and one that the Russian government is really struggling, and thus far not successfully struggling, to get under control.
Sorry, there I go again. But the good news, Chris, after all the bad news about health in Russia, the health of individual Russian leaders, the healthcare system for the country as a whole, the good news is that oil is standing strong and underpins the Russian economy, as we know. So at least he's got that going for him, or not.
That's right. The oil price crash that we've seen since January couldn't have come at a worse time, because the entire world is dealing with the negative effect of the COVID lockdowns. And Russia has implemented lockdowns quite similar to what we have in much of the United States, closing non-essential businesses, telling people to stay at home. But for Russia, that's only half the economic problem. The other half of the economic problem is the crash in oil. And oil and gas exports, depending on the year, make up something around half of Russia's exports. They provide something around half of the Russian government budget, slightly less than that in recent years. And so any decline in the price of oil is a serious economic challenge, but a collapse in the price of oil, like we've seen over the past couple of weeks, with oil briefly trading at negative numbers, at least for current deliveries of oil several weeks ago, is a really serious issue for Russia. Now, the good thing from Russia's perspective is that they've saved up some money from when oil prices were high to hold them over when prices are low. So their central bank has around $500 billion in foreign exchange reserves. The Russian government also has a sovereign wealth fund with around 150 billion in reserves. But when oil is where it's priced now at $25 or $30 a barrel, it's very easy to run through that type of money relatively quickly. And the risk that Russia faces is that if it wants to spend money to stimulate its economy or to provide relief for Russians who have been laid off, it actually doesn't have that much wiggle room in terms of its savings. And so the Russian government faces a dilemma. Do you try spending more now to provide for your citizens at the risk of spending down your reserves, or are you relatively more stingy, hoping people can make do on their own to save up the reserves that you've spent the last decade accumulating?
In which way is Russia leaning right now?
Well, I think there's a debate within the Russian government as to how much they have to do. There's a lot of people in the government that think having a big financial buffer is important for Russia, not only in economic terms, but also in geopolitical terms, because it's financial reserves that gives Russia the ability to withstand current and potential future U.S. sanctions. The more that Russia spends down its reserves, the less ability it has to face up to the U.S. And to survive threats of sanctions. But at the same time, just as in the U.S., there's been extraordinary demands on the government to provide income support to people who've lost their jobs. So too in Russia, the government faces similar demands. And although Putin is a dictator, he has to consider to a certain extent the interests of the population so he doesn't get a rebellion against him. And so the Kremlin is very wary of any situation that would see large numbers of Russians unemployed or incomes falling too much. There's a sort of balance between how much the Kremlin can tolerate people getting poorer versus running the risk that they'll eventually get fed up with the government.
We're getting great questions already, and I'm grateful for those. And I'm touching on some of those in the handful of questions I had prepared, which I'm partway through. You just mentioned geopolitics, U.S. sanctions. Can you talk through Putin's thinking toward why Putin decided to intervene in the Ukraine and how that's playing out for him, please?
Well, I think you've got to understand the question of Ukraine in the broader architecture of European security. From the perspective of the Russian side, when the Cold War ended, Russians thought they were getting an equal say in the government over all of Europe. So an equal say with the United States, an equal say with NATO. Now, no one in the United States thought that, no one in NATO thought that, but Russia thought they were going to be an equal player with veto power over Central and Eastern Europe, especially in the countries of the former Soviet Union. And Russia today thinks that that promise, which it believes it was given, has been violated by the United States and NATO. And so it's trying to stand up to what it perceives as being this violation. Now, we can argue about whether or not that's true, but that's certainly how the Russians see the world. And so when Russia looks at Ukraine or looks at Georgia, from the Russian view, these are countries that are in Russia's rightful sphere of influence. And so Russia thinks that it ultimately has much more of a say over governance in these countries than do the governments that have been elected by the people of these countries. And so when governments are elected in Ukraine or in Georgia that want to push back against Russia, the Russian government sees this as sort of a disrespectful act by governments that ought to realize they're second-tier governments in Russia's neighborhood. So when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and invaded the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine later that year, what Russia was trying to do was put pressure on Ukraine and force the Ukrainians to admit that they were going to be part of Russia's sphere of influence and follow Russia's direction. Now, that hasn't worked that well. Ukraine still is standing up for its independence of action. It's still standing up for its sovereignty. It hasn't recovered the territories that it lost to Russia, but it hasn't surrendered them either. And I think there's no sign that it plans to do so, nor is there any sign that the Georgian government plans to do so. And so as a result, you have this standoff between Russia and the West over the governance of Eastern Europe. Russia wants a sort of new Yalta where it can divide Europe into two, a Russian sphere and a Western sphere. And the Western view thus far has been, no, that's not a proper policy. Ukraine is an independent country. It can make its own sovereign decisions. Same too with Georgia and the other countries of the post-Soviet space. And there's no obvious way out of this disagreement since both sides firmly believe that they're right, which is why I think if we're looking into the future, we should expect more clashes between Russia and the West over hotspots like Ukraine, Georgia, and other parts of the post-Soviet space.
So we have that to look forward to. Talk us through Putin's involvement in our 2016 election back in the news just this week with the Attorney General Barr's decision to drop charges against Michael Flynn in connection with him lying about his involvement with Russia over right around the time of the 2016 elections.
Well, if you ask this question to a Russian foreign policy expert or one who is close to the Russian government, they'll tell you something along the following lines. They'll say, you Americans interfered in our domestic politics for years, if not decades, so surely you should expect you're going to get some of the same medicine. And I think that attitude explains a fair amount about the Kremlin's approach in aggregate to 2016 and probably today as well. There's a sense in Russia that actually what happened in 2016 was just reciprocation for what Russia perceives was done to it in the past. Now, I think we can ask a lot of questions as to whether that's a completely fair comparison. I would say probably not, but that certainly is the Russian view, that they're actually reacting to a status quo that was set up by the United States, which is why I think we shouldn't expect the Russian behavior to change. They think they're catching up to American techniques in hybrid warfare, for example, rather than devising any sort of new tactics. When you look at what Russia did in 2016, I think there was rather than one simple strategy, it was an effort in different spheres to try different tactics. There was buying of Facebook ads, there was hacking of email addresses, there was leaking of documents, because the Russian government didn't know what would work. So they decided they'd try multiple tactics and see what caught on and what didn't catch on. And I think that's still what drives Russian behavior in this sphere today. If you look at Russia's interference techniques in different countries, what you find is a whole gamut of different tactics being tried. Some work in various contexts, others work in other contexts. And I think from the perspective of right now, I see no reason to expect those to diminish either in the United States or in other countries that we might look at as well.
And what's your assessment of the relationship between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump?
I think you have to answer that on two different levels. There's the relationship between Trump and Putin, and there's the relationship between the Trump administration and Russia. And they've cut in very different directions, it seems. I think by any interpretation of the president's statements, he's tried to create a more cordial personal relationship with President Putin. Every time they meet, he's very open about wanting to sort of reset the relationship on a person-to-person level. If you look at the Trump administration, separate from the president's comments and listen to what Secretary of State Pompeo is saying, for example, you get a very different view. And the administration has taken a number of steps, especially on the military front and the nuclear front, that have angered the Russians, withdrawing from the INF Treaty, for example, which is one of the pillars of Cold War era arm control, was seen by the Russians as an aggressive and a destabilizing step, something that's very different from the narrative you hear when Trump talks about his desires to get along better with Putin. And so this dissonance between what the administration in aggregate has done and what Trump personally says is actually a source of much confusion, I think, on the Russian side. Many Russians think they ought to get along pretty well with Trump the individual, but they can't make any progress at all with the administration at large.
American policy, a well-oiled machine, all the gears meshing together like a clock. I'm going to pick up some of the great questions we've got from this fantastic audience, and I just clicked over. There are 7 screens full of people, and Zoom does 25 a screen. We believe that Chris is setting a new record for FPRI Zoom meetings, and I'd like to thank all of you for making it possible and tuning in. So far, it's been worth the price of admission. So a quick factual question from Dan Lieberman, Chris, if you don't mind. Wasn't Putin prime minister and not president for 4 years?
He was prime minister for less than 1 year and then became president after that.
And so
he was appointed prime minister as Yeltsin.
Okay, and so is this 20 years as president or 20 years in power?
This will be the 20th year as president.
A very good question from Valeria. I'm going to mess it up. Jegisman. How do you see the combination of the phenomena you described? That is some resentment, some Brezhnev sort of feelings in Russia towards Putin, the low oil prices we talked about, the pandemic we talked about. Is all of this going to moderate Putin's foreign policy, or is he going to try to distract from the perils and disasters at home? Is he going to be more military adventurism a la Ukraine over the time to come? And predictions are hard, especially about the future, but you've got this.
But if you zoom out and look at the last 20 years to just give us a framework for thinking about the future, I think what you find is that thus far there have been sort of two social contracts that have underlay the Putin era. The first social contract was during the 2000s when oil prices were shooting upwards over the course of the decade, and where Russians were getting better and better off each year. The government had lots of money, it distributed it to pensioners and to state employees, and Russian living standards increased very, very rapidly in the 2000s, so it was easy for Putin to be popular. Everyone was getting rich, no one had anything to complain about. After 2008, 2009, that changed. The financial crisis hit Russia very hard. It coincided with the decline in the price of oil. And so after 2008, 2009, the Kremlin realized it needed something new. It needed a new social contract to underpin Russian politics, because it was no longer the case that people's incomes were increasing at very rapid rates. In fact, since 2010, Russian living standards have more or less stagnated, depending on which metric you use. There's basically been no increase in quality of life. And so the new social contract that the Russian government turned to was a surge of patriotism and nationalism that was solidified by the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And so this turn towards distraction, towards patriotism, was crucial in undergirding Putin's second decade in power. The question, I think, is whether that will work in the third decade. And I think there are a lot of reasons for skepticism. If you look at polling data in Russia, and there's still one independent pollster in Russia that we think is pretty accurate numbers, polling shows that Russians have gotten a lot less excited about the annexation of Crimea over the past year. So if you ask the question of Russians in late 2014, how excited are you about Crimea, or do you support the annexation of Crimea? You got 80, 90, 95% of people saying, yes, this was an excellent idea. When you ask the question in recent years, what you find is that although most people are still in favor, the level of confidence they have that it was a good thing for Russia has declined. There's a lot more people, when you ask the question, was it good for Russia to annex Crimea, say probably, or say I'm not sure. Whereas in 2014, everyone said absolutely. And I think what this is evidence of is that the impact of nationalism, the impact of patriotism in Russian politics is on a sort of downward slope right now. Putin already got the benefit of the wave of post-Crimea patriotism, but I think that's a hard card to play twice. He's already played that once, and it's going to be difficult for him to repeat that. So then the question is, well, what's next? What's next? If you can't benefit from what worked in the 2000s, rising incomes, because oil prices are low and because of the COVID economic shock, you can't play the foreign policy card again because the population isn't responding to it today the way they responded to it in 2014. What other tools do you have? I think one way the Russian government is turning is by increasing the amount of repression that it's using. You see more censorship of the internet. You see more people being jailed for attending protests. It's nowhere like the level of repression that you see in China, far from it, but the tendency is towards an increase, sort of reminding people that there are dangers in getting involved in politics, and you're best off staying away from politics, staying at home rather than attending protests. This is certainly one way that Russian politics could continue to develop. But is it enough? I think that's the question. How much repression would you need to keep the populace off the streets in a period of steady or declining income standards, I think is a real open question. And it's worth remembering Russians have already faced a decade of stagnant incomes, a decade in which when the rest of the world's been getting better off, Russia's been falling behind, a decade in which the Russian elite has done basically nothing new. It's the same figures, just 10 or in some cases 20 years older. So the question is, can Russia employ the amount of repression that it needs to keep the system stable? I think the base case has got to be yes, but I think there's a question mark over that everyone in Russia senses, because for a long time, Putin got buy-in from the populace because everyone knew that he was supported by at least a small majority, in some cases a substantial majority of the population. There was a silent majority behind Putin. And as that silent majority begins to dissolve, I think the amount of repression that Putin will need begins to escalate. And the balance that he has to strike becomes harder and harder and harder. So that's the dilemma that the combination of COVID and the combination of the wearing off of the Crimea effect imposes for Putin as he tries to find a sort of third social contract to undergird his third decade in power.
And as always, the people who attend these events make them, and so it was. There were a number of people who asked questions similar to that question about future military adventurism and the long-term effects of Putin's military adventurism. We also got some fact-checking going on, and Chris, I believe I'm correct when I say that Medvedev was president between 2008 and 2012. He and Putin flipped jobs. Is that correct? Although more as a figurehead.
That's true. That's true. The proper way to say it is Putin is 20 years as Russia's ruler rather than as president. Although Putin was calling the shots when Medvedev was formerly the president.
Very good. And can you talk to how hard is it going to be for Putin to change the Constitution in the United States? That's a pretty tricky process. Not so much over there?
Well, it's interesting. I think when Putin launched the constitutional reform in January, everyone was surprised that it was coming now. Putin's term as president doesn't end until 2024, which is a long way away, 4 years away. By the current constitution, term limits prohibit Putin from running again. And so Putin launched a constitutional reform and in the process created a new position, the State Council, where many people thought he would leave the presidency and migrate to the State Council after 2024 and sort of rule from behind the scenes. That looked to be the plan in January and February, and many Russian political analysts thought the same. And then as the constitutional reform was pushed through the parliament, the Duma, at something like the last minute, a new amendment was added to reset term limits and to give Putin the ability to run twice more as president. So to run again in 2024 and then again for a second term after that. And this seems to me as something that wasn't planned that far in advance. It was rolled out in a sort of haphazard manner. Many of the Kremlin's allies weren't notified in advance. And so when I look at the constitutional process, actually, I'm somewhat confused by the extent to which it looks like it wasn't that well planned. And I think when the Russian government sets its mind to something, it's usually capable of pretty good planning. And in this case, I was actually less impressed by how orchestrated it seemed to be. It seemed sort of disorganized in its planning. It was easy to pass through parliament because Putin's got a stranglehold on the members of parliament. And then Putin said he was going to submit it to a national vote, not a referendum that would be binding, but rather a vote that would just prove that the Russian people were behind it and behind him. Now this vote has had to be postponed because of COVID. No one knows whether it will happen. The Kremlin promises it'll happen later this year, but it's hard to say. And so the Russian government faces, I think, something of a dilemma. They've promised a national vote to prove that the constitutional changes are popular, but holding a vote on constitutional changes in the midst of the worst economic union is not an optimal time to be reminding Russians that this vote will keep Putin in power for an additional 12 years. It's probably the worst possible time to hold a vote on one's popularity. So I think this vote question is a real dilemma, especially if you look at the polling around the vote. And what you find is the polling is really not very positive when you ask Russians in credible opinion polls, do they want Putin to be president essentially for life? people are very unsure about that. And what we've seen is a steady increase in the number of Russians who say that they want term limits on their president, that they want age limits on their president. Now a majority of Russians say they want an age limit of 70 on the Russian president, and Putin will be 70 at the time he has to run for re-election. So they're essentially saying they don't want Putin to run for re-election. You see a majority of Russians say they value more the ability to change the person in power than the benefit provided for stability. Again, that's a dangerous sign when Putin's number one promise for the Russian people is to provide for political stability. So when you look at all the polling on the Constitution, it all looks really quite negative from the Russian government's perspective. Yes, they've got control of parliament. Yes, they've got control of the media, but it's really not at all clear that they could actually win a fair vote on the Constitution. But it would be deeply embarrassing to promise a vote and then say, actually, looking at the polls, we've decided to pull it. Certainly that's one option that exists for them, but for someone who regularly talks about how popular he is and who reads opinion polls for everything we know on a daily basis, Putin is sensitive to his popularity. And I think it would be delegitimizing both for him personally, but also in the Russian elite at large to have to admit that he's gotten so unpopular that he can't even hold a constitutional vote. So this will be something interesting to follow over the course of this year.
If we're to postpone or cancel the vote because of COVID-19, would of course not be the only country that has considered, is considering, or has done such a thing. I'm interested that Russia is thinking about 70 as the cap on presidential elections. Of course, is now the full to have been 70 years old in order to run for president, apparently. Great question from Louis Padulo, sorry. To what extent is Putin able to blame the economic woes of his people on the United States, on U.S. sanctions, and is that tactic working for him?
When you look back to the period immediately after 2014, when the U.S. first imposed, alongside European allies, sanctions on Russia, at that time it was relatively easy for the Russian government to say, our economic problems are the result of our foreign enemies. Today, it's a different situation. There's no doubt that sanctions are still reducing investment in Russia, and as a result, bringing down the long-term rate of economic growth. But most of the problems that Russia faces domestically are problems that the Russian government has caused. And I think Russia's leadership is finding it harder and harder and harder to blame problems on the West. They certainly regularly try to do that. The Russian media has repeatedly reported, for example, that COVID was concocted by the U.S. government. There's no end in efforts to blame things on the U.S., but I think it's a harder sell among the Russian populace, especially when you look at the challenges that Russia faces today. The decline in oil prices wasn't the result of the United States. The economic cost of the lockdowns obviously wasn't the result of the United States. And so I think Russians are buying the argument much less today than they did in 2014 and 2015, that their economic problems are due to the United States. Now, the big question is, does the Russian opposition have an economic message that's more appealing? And the challenge that Russia's opposition faces is that Putin has been very effective in keeping them far from any sorts of real power. They're not allowed on Russian state TV, except when they're being occasionally hauled in front of a court and charged with bogus crimes. They're increasingly facing judicial pressure for crimes that are generally drummed up by the Russian government. They're banned in many cases from running even for the smallest local elections. So the Russian opposition really struggles to get a alternate story out there. And that's Putin's greatest asset right now, is that people might let no alternative that they're aware of.
And were there to be an alternative? So we've just seen what we thought was possibly a secession crisis in North Korea. If there were an alternative to Putin, successor to Putin, who might that be?
But there's lots of gossip around Moscow as to who's lined up to take power after Putin leaves. But I think we can say a couple things with confidence. One is that Putin's not planning to leave. The constitutional reform process made that very clear. In January, February, to the state council and let someone else be president, then it was an interesting guessing game to ask, well, who would then be the president? But now that we know that Putin plans to run for the presidency again, all questions of succession have been postponed. It seems like 12 more years to 2036. Now, it's not clear that Putin's going to live that long, and it's always possible that he too catches COVID or dies in some other fashion. Per the Russian constitution, if he were to leave the scene tomorrow, Dmitry Medvedev, Mikhail Mishustin would now become president, the prime minister. But he wouldn't be nearly as powerful as President Putin, and there would be immediate jockeying behind the scenes over what would come next. There are a number of people that have been trying to position themselves as potential successors, but Putin, like every smart dictator, has been making sure that he doesn't have an obvious successor. And if you're someone who wants to succeed Putin, it's dangerous to make yourself look like you're trying to position yourself as a successor, because of course you make it more likely that you get pushed to the side because Putin thinks you're starting to look threatening. So I think the honest answer is we could give you a list of 6 or 12 or 18 people who might be the successor, but there's really no way of knowing, and nobody knows, because it will all depend on the dynamics that happen whenever Putin does finally leave the scene.
It is the tallest poppies that have their heads cut off first.
Indeed.
I think that's an Afghan proverb, but the Russians would certainly understand it. A question about what we talked about his near abroad policy. Can you talk about Putin's policy in the Middle East with a particular focus on Syria? What is he trying to accomplish there, and how is that working for him?
This is an area where Russia's devoted a lot of resources in the past half decade, and it's an area where we've seen the biggest change in Russian foreign policy, because before 2015, Russia really hadn't taken the Middle East that seriously for several decades, since the middle of the Cold War. It had relationships in the Middle East. It has a deep pool of experts on the politics of the Middle East. Some of the best experts in the world, I would argue, are in Moscow, but the Russian government hadn't made it a priority. That began to change in 2015, primarily because Russia perceived that the United States was, to a certain extent, withdrawing or creating openings that Russia could take advantage of, and because Russia believed that by applying a relatively limited amount of resources, Russia could make itself perceived as a great power. And indeed, that's exactly what's happened. I think it's impossible to see Syria as anything other than a real success for the Kremlin, with the very discerning application of military force in a way that hasn't gotten Russia bogged down in a second Afghanistan, as many Americans predicted would happen. Russia's managed to change the course of the war in Syria, show off its military, which has improved substantially its performance over the past decade, and made itself an indispensable player in Middle Eastern politics. It's one of the few countries that has very cordial relations with Israel and Syria and Iran and Saudi Arabia. Very few world leaders can have the leaders of Iran and Israel and Saudi visit their capital on a back-to-back basis, and yet the Russians can't. They're not best friends with any country in the region. They're not looking to do favors for anyone in the region, but they do have good ties with every regional player, and that's made them a part of the conversation almost everywhere. If Syria is ever going to be resolved, it's going to be resolved with Russia being the dominant party at the table. Libya as well. Russia's made itself indispensable to resolving that conflict, if ever that will be resolved. And in other parts of the Middle East too, Russia's asserting itself. Yemen is a good example, Egypt, in ways that we haven't seen Russia in a long time. From the perspective of the Russian government, this has been so effective because it makes Russia look like a great power. It makes Russia feel like a great power at relatively low cost. The downside of Ukraine was that Russia plunged itself into a very difficult struggle with the West that lasted half a decade and is going to last at least that long before it's resolved. It suffered economic sanctions. It suffered a collapse in its relations with Ukraine, which used to be its largest trading partner. In the Middle East, Russia's had very little backlash. There's very few Middle Eastern countries that think less of Russia today than they did 5 years ago. And in many countries, people see Russia as a credible interlocutor, as a supplier of effective military equipment, and as a serious regional player. And that's something Russia's accomplished at relatively low cost. So I think when you look at what Russia's done in Ukraine and compare that to the success that Russia's had in Syria, it seems to me that the Middle East has been a relative success story for Russian foreign policy compared to what things look like in Europe.
And to what extent is that a reflection of, this is not necessarily your field, but from the Russian perspective, of an opportunity granted to it by a withdrawal of influence from the United States in the Middle East, and conversely, what appears to have been, in my opinion, pretty effective American policy in response to the Ukraine intervention. So you've discussed Russia as if it were acting in a vacuum, and of course, maybe it's not true. Maybe it's not true that, of course, the United States, but discuss American influence vis-a-vis Russia on both in both areas, please.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that the United States and the West in general thinks Ukraine is a lot more important than Syria. Ukraine borders many of our NATO allies. If you had a breakdown in the Ukrainian government, you have refugees flowing in even greater numbers than they flowed from Syria, just because the geography is that much closer. So there's a lot of Western interest in making sure that the Ukrainian state and society continue functioning and come to function better and begin to play a bigger role in European politics and security. Syria, the perception of the U.S. government, and I think this is a matter of some continuing debate, but under the Obama administration and the Trump administration, has been that Syria ultimately is an area where the U.S. shouldn't get very involved. They can get a little bit involved, but there's never been a desire to devote a lot of resources, which is why Russia's had, to a certain extent, an open playing field in which to expand its influence. I still think, though, it's worth noting that Russia's played its cards relatively better in Syria than Ukraine. In Ukraine, Russia intervened and angered most Ukrainians in the process, to the extent that Russia's popularity with Ukraine is at really historic lows. Whereas in Syria, it depends which groups of Syrians you talk to, but the Syrian government is extraordinarily appreciative of what Russia's done. So a very different view than you get when you talk to people in Kiev.
Interesting. Question from John Rapazzo. From your description, you described the authoritarianism of the Chinese government as being much more repressive than Russia. You described Russian public opinion as having some influence on Putin's freedom of action. To what extent is Russia authoritarian? To what extent is it a democracy? To what extent can people freely express their opinions and have their opinions influence Russian policy and actions?
I think there's no doubt that Russian politics have to be categorized as authoritarian. There is a parliament, of course, there are elections, but there's no opposition in any sort of real sense. So the key test of being a democracy is having competitive politics. Russia doesn't have those. The media is not free, especially when you focus on the TV stations that people watch. So there's no question that Russia's not a democracy, despite having some of the appearance of a democracy. And it's important, I think, for the Kremlin to keep up the appearance, because it tells itself and tells the Russian public they are a democracy, even as it whittles away at the actual institutions that underlie democratic politics. But I think it's also the case that compared to other countries like China, there's a level of difference. In the Russian government, censorship certainly exists, but it's less strict than in China. If you are in Russia, you can go to most foreign websites. There's only a small number of exceptions and access them with relative ease. The internet is actually a place where the Russian opposition has relatively more free reign, although it's beginning to be clamped down on. But there's nothing like the Great Firewall that China has, and the ability to express private opinions is broader in Russia today than it is in a place like China. The trend is certainly in the wrong direction. No one would say that there's the expression of free political speech is allowed, especially for opposition politicians, but nevertheless, there is some more openness in Russia than you get in other countries that we would also describe as authoritarian. On the question of public opinion polling, scholars have looked into this a lot, and I think the majority of opinion is that it's probably the case that if you ask Russians, do you trust Putin or do you support Putin, the polls will give you a slightly biased answer on the high side. There are certain people who would like to answer no, but don't feel comfortable and so answer yes. But it seems, in my own personal experience, and I think this is a consensus among most people who follow these questions closely, broadly speaking, the trend lines are accurate. When we see an increase in support for Putin or decrease, that's reflecting real trends in public opinion shifts. Maybe it's all slightly biased by 5 or 10 points to the upside, but there's no doubt that even today, a substantial chunk of Russians think that Putin is doing a fine job and support him. That's not all simply the result of media manipulation.
A couple of different questions about a question I should have thought to answer, and I'm grateful to the group for asking it. Discuss the nature and the status of Chinese-Russian relations.
Well, if you ask the Russian government, Chinese-Russian relations are the best they've ever been. And there's a certain extent in which that's true. Putin and Xi have meetings on a regular basis. I forget the number of meetings they've had over the past couple of years, but it's almost once a month you see them meeting in different international settings. Xi has described Putin as his best friend. I don't know if that's true, but I guess it's a signal as to how the Chinese value the relationship as well. And it's certainly the case that both Russia and China agree on their number one challenge, and their number one challenge is the United States. Both of them see confronting the U.S. in a diplomatic sense, in a political sense, in a military sense as their number one goal, and so they're happy to work together on that issue. And because it's the most important issue, it dominates all other disagreements that they have. They do, of course, have disagreements. There's a long history of Russia and China disagreeing on a whole number of issues, from the location of their border to who's the dominant power in Central Asia. But today, all of those questions have been kicked into the long grass. They're questions for the future. The question that's most important in Beijing and Moscow right now is, how do they stand up to the United States? And what we've seen over the past couple of years is more and more alignment between Beijing and Moscow on this issue. That's not to say that they agree on everything, far from it. It's not to say that they're allies. Although some Russians have started to use the word allies, neither the Russian nor the Chinese government use that phrase. But they describe it as a strategic partnership, and I think that's basically accurate. They're partners in the number one strategic goal of both countries, which is the confrontation or the competition with America. And
staying on foreign policy, we've got time for just a couple more questions. I know Raleigh's giving me the hairy eyeball, but we'll get a couple more in. What are the European countries that are closest to Russia, and has their desire to be close to Russia changed with the changes in the oil markets? I think many European countries were constrained by, they didn't want to be as aggressive in response to Russian aggression because they needed Russian oil. Has that diminished?
It has diminished a lot, and it's not just been a factor of the last couple of months as oil prices have declined, and gas, which Russia imports which Russia exports substantial quantities of to Europe, is generally tied to the price of oil. Well, it's getting looser. But the key shift is that in the past, most countries in Central and Eastern Europe imported almost all of their gas from Russia because the pipelines only ran in one direction. They ran from east to west. And so from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Bulgaria, all the way down to the Black Sea and the Adriatic, most of those countries relied entirely for their winter heat on Russia's willingness to sell them gas. Over the past 10 years, however, the gas market has changed drastically in Europe. Russia is still, in quantitative terms, one of the most important suppliers to most countries, but the gas market shifted in a couple ways. One is that Europe's begun integrating its pipeline network. And so in the past, pipes only ran from east to west, but now there are more north-south connections too. And so many countries in Central Europe now have a choice. Do you buy gas from Russia, or do you buy gas from, say, Norway or Algeria or other suppliers? That's one big shift. When you have a choice, obviously you can negotiate harder with the Russians. The second big shift is that liquefied natural gas has come on the market, which means that you can now buy gas from Qatar, from Australia, from the United States, and this has also provided a lot of new flexibility. And so most of the countries that used to rely for 90 or even 100% of their gas from Russia now have options. They have options to buy from other countries on Europe's borders, they have options to buy from further afield. And so as a result, Russia's leverage to use gas as a political weapon has declined substantially. It hasn't gone away, but it's a lot lower than it used to be. And the best evidence for this is the price. Russia used to charge its Eastern European neighbors far more for gas than it charged Central and Western European countries, because Western Europe had multiple sources of supply, whereas Eastern Europe had one source of supply. Now we look at the price differential between Western and Eastern Europe, it's a lot lower because Eastern Europeans can negotiate. They've got multiple sources. So Russia's ability to use energy as a tool or a political weapon still exists in certain specific areas, but it's declined a lot over the past decade.
Do we have time for one more question, Raleigh?
Yeah.
We do, absolutely. Great.
Yeah.
So we'll stay in Europe then. Do you have any thoughts about Putin's intentions toward the Baltics, Chris?
This has been an area of great focus for the U.S. and for NATO since 2014. There was great fear at the time that the types of little green men who arrived in Crimea and began seizing public buildings might try to do something similar in the parts of the Baltic states that border Russia. My sense, talking with people in the Baltics and talking with Russians as well, is that there's two things that are. One is that the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, are in NATO, and NATO membership matters hugely to Russia. Russia is willing to do things in non-NATO member states that it's not willing to do in NATO member states. That's a very serious issue for the Russians. The second thing is that the Baltic states and NATO in general have taken a really serious effort over the past 6 years to plug holes in their vulnerabilities. And so I think the types of situation that we saw in Crimea in 2014 is really hard to imagine, because the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and the NATO forces that are now there have really done a lot to deal with some of the vulnerabilities that the Ukrainians face. I think what's important to remember is that when the Russian little green men first arrived in Crimea, the order from the Ukrainian government was don't shoot. And the advice from Washington was don't shoot. That was the recommendation, to try to negotiate a peaceful end with the little green men. That didn't work. That policy didn't work. If something similar was tried in Estonia or Latvia, I have a really hard time to get similar recommendations from the US or similar orders from the local governments. And I think the Russian government knows that the response would be different, and so isn't going to take that type of step in the Baltic states.
So deterrence continues to work. We've got another half a dozen questions. Chris has kept his audience. We're still at 7 screens. It's a really extraordinary accomplishment. The most extraordinary part of it, though, is that Chris has, I believe, a new 8-week-old baby in the house, and the baby has been absolutely silent. So, Chris, for all your skill in understanding Russian foreign and domestic policy, the most impressive thing about you, as far as I'm concerned, is that you kept an 8-week baby quiet for a full hour. Congratulations from all of us at FPRI for that new gift, that bundle of joy in your house. Congratulations, and thank you for a great presentation. Huge thanks to the crowd, and back to your president, Raleigh Flynn.
Well, thank you, Chris and John, for and kudos to Chris as well as an extraordinary father for keeping your new baby silent. John, great moderation, great questions. Thanks to the audience for really so many great questions. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and hope you'll take the opportunity to look at our website, www.fpri.org. If you're not already a member, please consider joining us. We also welcome your feedback. Feel free to write to us, and we usually write back. We always try to write back. We don't always succeed, but we do try. To you and your families, please stay safe, and we wish you well. Thanks again. Bye-bye.